Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. We're so glad you've joined us today. I'm Elif Sarican, writer, editor, translator, and your host. At the Amargi Mosaic, we're piecing together conversations from Kurdistan and the Middle East, bringing you stories and insights you might not hear elsewhere. We're a grassroots-funded media collective powered by journalists and academics who believe in independent voices, not corporate agendas. So whether you're here to learn, stay informed, or simply curious about the region, you're in the right place. Before we dive in, don't forget to follow us at theamargi.com and all the social media platforms you see on your screen. Your support helps us grow and keep these conversations alive. So let's get started with today's conversation. Hello, Arzu Yilmaz. How are you today?
Hello, Elif. Thank you very much. I'm fine. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. So you're an associate professor of politics and international relations and at the University of Kurdistan Hewlêr, where you've been since 2022. You're the author of From Atroush to Makhmour, Kurdish Refugees and Reconstruction of Identity, based on your doctoral dissertation and extensive ethnographic fieldwork, which we'll definitely be talking about today. You were an Alexander von Humboldt scholar at the University of Hamburg and previously a postdoctoral researcher at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Your work, particularly on Turkish foreign policy, the Kurdish question, and refugee politics, has appeared in numerous academic journals, and you've become particularly known for your analysis of Turkey's regional ambitions. So thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us today. I wanted to start with a question about, particularly about Makhmour. And the reason why I think this area of conversation and this area is very important is because I think you've done a really good work around breaking the usual ways in which so-called geopolitics are discussed. And I think the way you brought in particularly Mahmur, a refugee camp, which I'd like to hear a bit more about in a second, and, you know, society, people in exile into this conversation and how they are in the dynamics of geopolitics and particularly what perhaps justice may look like for them, I think is a very important discussion, particularly now. And your book traces the journey of Kurdish refugees from Atroush camp near the Turkish border to Makhmour, which you describe through your ethnographic work. And these camps weren't just temporary shelters or safe havens, but became sites where political identities were reconstructed. And nearly 30 years after the displacement began, you know, in the 80s and then in the 90s, Makhmour in particular still exists with around 12,000 residents, periodically targeted by Turkish drones, yet maintaining its unique political structure, which, again, we will talk about throughout our conversation as well. What I wanted to ask you is, what does the persistence of Makhmour, neither fully integrating into Iraqi Kurdistan, nor, at least for now, returning to within, you know, the borders of Turkey, and, you know, almost creating a separate, you know, political status or a polity for themselves, tell us about how refugee spaces become important features of political landscapes, particularly in the context of the PKK and the broader Kurdish freedom movement. And I think the reason why I also think this conversation is important, or this question is important, is because we see with other peoples where the role the refugee kind of community plays. You know, this has been seen particularly in the case of Palestine and how the refugee camps across Lebanon and Syria and so on were for a long time, and I think for some are still considered to be very important sites of struggle. So yeah, what do you have to say about this?
First of all, thank you very much for raising Makhmour on the agenda of discussions taking place today. Because in my point of view, actually, once I confess that whatever I know about Kurdish movement, half of it depends on what I learned in Mahmur. The very first point, which is also to a large extent valid today, I would like to clarify, is the assumption about Mahmur camp. It was like early 2010s when I decided to conduct my PhD dissertation research on Kurdish refugees in Kurdistan. Of course, eventually, Makhmour was the first potential case I would focus on. And there was a kind of widely shared assumption about Makhmour camp. It is a PKK military base, and those people living in Makhmour are simply PKK people. And there was the assumption was like those people, although Makhmour camp was established in 1998 by UNHCR, and those people were recognized as refugees since early 1990s when they first fled to Iraqi Kurdistan. That was a widely shared assumption. However, on the other hand, in literature, as we know, being refugee sometimes under certain circumstances could be a way of emancipation. And particularly refugee warriors, actually this is a kind of misnaming, also discussed in literature as misnaming. However, at the end of the day, people living in Makhmour, refugees living in Makhmour, was very much, when we look at their action, the story of immigration and so forth, it was appropriate to portray them as refugee warriors. What does refugee warriors mean? A group of refugees who side by an armed group in pursuit of a clear political goal. So in that sense, yes, those were refugee warriors. But what I finally tried to examine and find out was whether this group, people in Makhmour, also experienced being a refugee as a way of emancipation. If so, then emancipation in what sense? Is it also true for the relation with the PKK, or just true with the relation with the homeland? So all in all, at the end of the day, what I had figured out was first and foremost, yes, those people, refugees sided by the PKK in pursuit of a political goal. First, this goal has gradually changed in time, and I tried to examine what was the reaction of refugees to those changes. But at the same time, I tried to understand what is the capacity of agency of the refugees. And at the end of the day, this is why I argue that whatever I know about Kurdish movement mostly depends on what I learned in Makhmour. I have realized that, for instance, the PKK's strength as an authority, its power as an authority, actually depends on to what extent the PKK aligns its political orientation with the expectations of refugees. Not as it is argued in the literature, those refugees' emancipation is taking place due to to what extent they side by the armed group. So all in all, this was a long, over 30 years story, which finally concluded in the case of Makhmour. And as of today, Makhmour, as you have also underlined, Makhmour is a quite unique example in terms of refugee warriors, other refugee warriors examples, by implementing their own their own political, achieving their own goals, political goals, and experiencing being a refugee as an emancipation and a way of reaching out their political goals. Today, being a refugee in Makhmour camp constitutes an identity differentiating from being a Kurdish, being a PKK sympathizer, or being anyone, any Kurds from any part of Kurdistan or even in diaspora.
From, hearing what you're saying, perhaps, because the people who eventually settled in Makhmour, you also talk about how when they first went to that the physical space where Makhmour was built, it was essentially a desert, with snakes and other creatures, and they really created life physically, but also like socio-politically from scratch. And I think, as someone who obviously didn't experience that, I'm very careful talking about it in this way, but perhaps it's almost a silver lining when you have no choice but to rebuild your life from scratch. Then you can choose exactly how you build it. And it seems like Makhmour, and it's very interesting hearing what you say in terms of, rather than Makhmour just being influenced by the Kurdish movement's ideology and political frameworks, it actually had an influence on the way the Kurdish movement shaped itself as well. And I imagine, and I've heard you say in other places as well, particularly shaped the way Öcalan thought about the concept of Kurdistan and what that looks like. How do you see that, and the way that perhaps Makhmour, and I guess, the lived experience of Makhmour, how has it shaped the Kurdish movement's politics?
For instance, very much at the beginning, in the occasion of Atroush camp, the PKK's political goal was establishing independent Kurdistan. And in doing so, what the PKK tried to do in the case of Atroush camp, they first tried to pick a sort of, let's say, PKK-ification, before which had a huge impact on the experience of emancipation. So, for instance, people were wearing guerrilla dresses, dressing like guerrilla in Atroush camp, and finally, what they aimed to achieve, the PKK achieved in Atroush camp, was having civil people fully engaged with the armed groups and acting as civil, civil wing of the armed group. But the consequence, as I tried to discuss in my dissertation, was not exactly the PKK aimed at achieving. And in that sense, the agency of refugees, it came to surface, and I tried to trace the negotiations took place between the authority and people, or let's say between the PKK and people. And that's why I argued that at the end of the day, yes, to some extent, PKK tried to give shape to the identity of the people, but at the end of the day, the identity preferences came to surface depending on people's, the way people understood, the way people experienced the refugee, being a refugee. And at the end of the day, what I have realized, what being a refugee was an experience of emancipation on one hand, but at the end of the day, being a refugee, in the case of Atroush or in the case of Makhmour, at the end of the day, to a large extent, shaped the PKK's also policies, and the strength of PKK at the end of the day was dependent to what extent PKK's policies met with the expectations of the refugees. So that's why it was first not relevant to argue that those people were simply PKK people, or to argue that either Atroush camp or Makhmour camp were simply military bases.
What do you see the role of particularly Turkey, and also can you talk a bit more about this resplitting of Kurdistan?
I would like to add 2 short sentences in relation with the question you raised first. The story in Atroush started with PKKification, but resulted in Kurdification in the way the refugees understood. That is the shortest sentence I could explain the story of Kurdish refugees in Kurdistan in a Makhmour case. Second, I would like to also add in relation with their experience in Kurdistan. For a long time, let me say by the 1990s, but particularly after 2000s, Iraqi Kurdistan turned into a sort of hub for all Kurds, from, when I say all Kurds, Kurds from Iran, Kurds from Syria, and in the case of Mahmur, also Kurds from Turkey. It is also important to highlight that given what we have learned from the experience of refugees in Mahmur, unfortunately, as of today, it's not easy to say that Iraqi Kurdistan still functions as a hub or a safe haven for the Kurds from different parts of Kurdistan. So this is, and these 2 sentences, I think, would help to enrich whatever I try to explain in the context of Mahmur. But given your second question in terms of Turkey's intention and Turkey's intentions, motivation in first making peace with the Kurds, and in a broader context, Turkey's policies in the Middle East. What I argue, given this newly initiated peace process, it is not just by coincidence, or we can't claim that it's just by coincidence. Each time Turkey initiates a peace process, we observe a dramatic, fundamental geopolitical shift in the Middle East. This is very much, in my point of view, this is very much linked with Turkey's aspirations about the Middle East. And this also tells us that ultimately Turkey's intention is not finally initiating a peaceful solution to the Kurdish question in Turkey, but rather than that, instrumentalizing the Kurdish question to reach out its ultimate goals in the Middle East. In this context, what we are experiencing today is another geopolitical shift taking place in the Middle East, and again, like Turkey did in early 1990s, or like Turkey did in mid-2000s by initiating Oslo talks immediately after the invasion of Iraq, or Israeli process which took place again immediately after a geopolitical turmoil in the Middle East, which was the Arab Spring. Today, again, Turkey is coming to the surface, surprisingly, with a proposal of peace with the Kurds. The discourse of each peace process we have experienced so far highlighted Turkey's or shed light on Turkey's motivations. Turkey's motivations by reference to National Pact. As you may know, National Pact was the initial agreement by which the Kurds and Turks in early 20th century agreed upon when they decided to fight against the imperial powers, which included that National Pact. The boundaries of that National Pact includes today's roughly today's northern Syria and Iraq. And what is clear in each peace initiative case in past and today is Turkey seeks to expand its sphere of influence towards the Kurdish majority populated areas, namely in Iraqi Kurdistan and Syrian Kurdistan. What I understand from the Kurdish response or Kurdish political actors' response, yes, they also at least don't have a clear objection to Turkey's proposal. However, this is conditional with recognition of the Kurds' status, not only Kurds' status, but also the status of Kurdistan as a sub-national political entity. Would it be possible what we have been experiencing in the Syrian theater, particularly since the fall of Assad, doesn't really give much hope about a peaceful solution on the ground. And as I understand, or as I have argued since the beginning of this process, which is actually over 1 year, exactly 1 year, passed over these last efforts, Erdogan's, I argued that Erdogan's Kurdish peace with the Kurds was not a plan A for Erdogan. Actually, the fall of Assad, I think, in a way verified my argument. And finally, what we see here is Turkey's intentions not limited with enjoying a full control within the context of National Pact over the Kurdish populated areas in Syria and Iraq. But beyond that, Turkey seeks for influence, either political or military influence, beyond the borders of Kurdistan, including Baghdad and Damascus. In my point of view, this is the reason why this traditional Israeli-Turkey relations also facing nowadays with challenge, because this is very clearly contradicting with the political goals of Israel, which also wants to have a power over both Baghdad and Damascus, given its security concerns. All in all, at the end of the day, the picture which appears before our eyes indicates a serious, huge gap between the positions of the Kurdish actors and Turkey, or the political actors in Turkey. What Turkey seeks, as we have observed after the fall of Assad, is a centralized Islamist government in Syria, backed with a constitution which grants Kurds at best some cultural rights. However, on the contrary, what the Kurds seek for in Syria is a decentralized government, which is backed with a constitution which grants collective rights of Kurds, but not only that, but also guarantees collective rights of Kurds, but also the guarantees Kurdistan's status as a national, subnational political entity. It is difficult to make a prediction about the fate of this process, but the current circumstances simply indicate that there is no any easy solution ahead in short term.
I want to ask, where I think there's a lot to say, particularly about the shifts in the region, particularly the change in some of the geopolitics that perhaps 2 or 3 years ago would have never been foreseen. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Do you think that, the latest, the peace process before this latest process that is being developed still was, between 2013 and 2015, which seemed to a lot of people following that it ended very, very abruptly. Do you think, or what do you think there is to learn, particularly from that process? What do you think everyone involved perhaps needs to do differently? And also, what a lot of people are talking about is that the main difference in this process is the seeming buy-in from the leader of the Nationalist People's Party, Devlet Bahçeli, who was until quite recently one of the chief opponents of any consideration of peace. A lot of people are saying that is already the biggest difference. But what would you say is some of the most important lessons to learn from a decade ago?
There are some similarities, as I also tried to highlight with reference to the relation between geopolitical shift and Turkey's motivations in terms of making peace with the Kurds. But at the same time, there are huge differences in terms of the positions of the parts. First of all, Turkey, on the contrary, to early 2010s, or when the process took place, Turkey is in a quite, either in political or in economic terms, in a quite weak position. Let me remind you, Erdogan's visit to Washington, even Erdogan's legitimacy in Turkey, obviously, as of today, dependent to the support of Trump or the support of external powers. This was not the case in early 2010s when the peace process took place. Second, in geopolitical terms, Turkey is quite disadvantaged in the region. In early 2010s, throughout the Arab Spring, I was again here in Iraqi Kurdistan, traveling the region. And yes, I should acknowledge that Turkey had, to some extent, a positive reputation, attraction in the region. So Turkey's proposal or leadership role, let's say, was to some extent quite welcomed by some groups in the Middle East, as far as Turkey was representing a democratic Muslim country, posturing a democratic Muslim country. But in last 10 years in particular, many things changed. Not only in terms of Turkey's political orientation, but also in terms of the people's expectations and understanding. And Turkey, at the end of the day, is not anymore a privileged regional power in the Middle East. It is, as I have tried to explain, it is politically, both politically and economically weak. Second, in last 10 years' time, in terms of balance of power in the region, many things has changed against Turkey's position. First and foremost, Israel emerged as Israel has always been a regional power, but emerged with a posture of hegemonic power in the Middle East, which has to a large extent, through Abraham Accords, solved its problems with the Gulf states, or let's say with the Arab countries to a large extent. So this newly emerging Middle East, with the economic, with the newly drawn maps of trade routes or energy flow, or the all aspects of security architecture of the Middle East, simply put, in my point of view, push Turkey from the center of Middle East towards the periphery of the region. So this is also one of the biggest challenges in terms of the and maybe last difference in comparison with early 2010s. Long and short, at the end of the day, is good life expectations of people in the region as of today, not inspired with the practice of Turkey, but with the practice of Gulf. So all in all, I hope I could explain briefly the change in Turkey's position, but also it is there are some remarkable changes in the position of the Kurds. When the Kurds intended to broker a peace agreement with Turkey, we were very much at the beginning, early stage of Rojava experience. Today, just yesterday, we have witnessed, not only yesterday, but in the last 10 years' time, long and short, Rojava administration became a strategic partner, as their counterparts became a strategic partner of the West. And the Rojava experience in Syria, the limits it has reached out so far is too difficult to roll back. The experience of people, the experience of administration, and the military force, the capability of the military force is difficult to roll back today. So not as of today, Turkey, different from early 2010s, has not only a Kurdish entity in Iraq, but also facing with the Kurdish political entity, not only in Iraq, but also has to tackle with a internationally de facto recognized Kurdish political entity in Syria, which then strengthens the position of the Kurds. And ultimately, what the Kurds seek for in the case of Iraq and Syria, which are obviously failed states, to become legitimate actors of these two given territories, and finally have more voice in the center of these both countries, while centralization prevails as a trend in world politics, particularly in the region. So they have a great potential of becoming political actors, in the countries they reside. Second, they have both of them have strong military forces. And third, this is true. I think no one will claim that the Kurdish, no one can claim that the Kurdish populated areas in both Iraq and Syria could be ruled without the consent of the Kurds anymore in both Syria and Iraq. So all in all, the Kurds have strengthened their position in comparison with early 2010s. However, it's also it's necessary to discuss the potential partnership, potential of making partnerships in the region from Kurdish point of view. As I have often argued that since the 1990s, in the case of, for instance, Iraqi Kurdistan, Turkey was the only option to cooperate, and it was like an obligation, but not a political preference to cooperate with Turkey. But as of today, today's Middle East, the Kurds have other options, not only Israel, but also the Gulf states, which are actually dominating the public opinion or the course of developments in the Arab world. At the end of the day, Iraq and Syria are Arab majority. If they are not Arab countries, they are Arab majority countries, and we can't deny or avoid the influence of the Gulf states in both countries. So in relation with that, Gulf countries, in my point of view, rather than Israel, also have a great potential to cooperate with the Kurds. Peace was more achievable in early 2010s, but it is, as of today, it's more difficult to achieve a peace between the Kurds and Turkey. Strategic partnership, if the case is, ultimate goal is building up a strategic partnership, yes, this is possible, as far as two parts make some compromises, but in terms of a sustainable, peaceful solution to the Kurdish question, honestly speaking, I'm not very much optimistic about it.
Do you think part of it is because what Turkey is maybe motivated by is, particularly in the last few years, and that's from what I can observe, also another big difference is the United States has been maneuvering a bit more towards the Gulf states as almost as their representatives in the region from Turkey. And do you think that is also connected to, some of the ways, and I think you mentioned this before as well, some of the ways in which Turkey is trying to shift from some of its economic dependence on Russian gas to American contracts to almost appease the US to say we are still very important partners? Or do you think they're not losing their status as strategic partners? It's just that the Gulf has kind of been elevated a bit more in the regional dynamics.
Thanks for asking this question, because this question reminded me something I didn't mention in terms of the American-Turkish relations. But before starting, let me give reference to Tom Barrack's last interview published on Financial Times. Here, because for a long time, I have been arguing that the America, or let's say the United States of America, doesn't have a grand strategy concerning the Middle East. And in relation with this, against the past, Turkish-American relations. Turkey, from the American point of view, there's no any clear mission Turkey can accomplish in the Middle East. Why I refer to Tom Barak, because there, crystal clear, he states that first, we don't have any plan about the survival of countries in the region. Second, in terms of Turkish-Kurdish relations or Turkey's position in the Middle East, I think what he says really sheds light on some quite conflicting issues. He says, for instance, and I will try to remember, is Syria going to end up having a decentralized government? Probably. Is Syria going to have some sort of relations with Israel? Hopefully. Is Syria going to have some a kind of buffer zone in the region, in Turkey's close to Turkey's border, appropriately? So, first of all, it's important to clarify the position of America with reference to this statement, Tom Barak's statement. The United States of America does not have a grand strategy for the Middle East. He clearly states that we are not interested in any scenario for the survival of countries. They will do so. So, in this context, what regulates in the Middle East, not only in the Middle East, actually, in the world today, the soul of time indicates that the only power makes sense, but not the norms, not the values or the rules, international law, and so forth. And given that, if America doesn't have a plan for the Middle East, and in relation with this, Turkey doesn't have any mission to implement with the support of America, then to what extent Turkey could succeed in achieving its goals in the Middle East, while power is the only determining factor in making policy, not only in the Middle East, but also in the world. As I have recently highlighted, Turkey not only disadvantaged in terms of the course of developments in the Middle East took place in the last 10 years' time, but also quite in a weak position because of its economic situation and its economic instability or political instability. What I understand from the interaction between Trump and Russia, what the United States expects Turkey to play, if the United States wants Turkey to play a role, that role is not in the Middle East, in my point of view, but in north of Turkey, basically in its relations with Russia. So this is a very crucial point, since Turkey, the security of Black Sea, the security of Europe, which is very much linked with security of Black Sea, security of Europe. These are the most important topics on the security agenda of the world today. And if Turkey, at the end of the day, will play a role with the support of the United States of America in the region, this region will not be the Middle East, in my point of view, but Caucasus and the Russian-dominated regions, including the region of Black Sea.
I think that's a really important point, and perhaps, Trump, in his own way, when he said in September, 2025, recently said something along the lines of to Erdogan when they met in the White House that, this guy won't admit it, but Syria, he did it, and was like giving him the credit for it. And I was thinking about this, and perhaps it was in his own way saying, it's fine if you take credit for it, but leave it to us from now on. And the reason why I thought...
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you, but I think it is necessary to remind people listening to us that first Israel and Netanyahu claimed that we did. Then Turkey was silent. Recently, United Kingdom, British appeared in Istanbul and claimed that we did. We toppled Assad. So that's why it's clear that what happened in Syria in December 2024 was a consequence of cooperation between Israel, United States of America, Turkey, and Britain.
And there's been a lot of reports that particularly Jolani, Ahmed El-Shara, was essentially being prepared for this role for about a year before to be able to, basically be a statesman. There's been reports around the involvement of particularly British think tanks, which this is why I think some of Trump's comments was very interesting for a lot of people, hearing them in terms of Erdogan and Syria and so on. And I think, you said some of your recent analysis also suggests that, for example, if Israel consolidates control in the south of Syria and becomes as influential in Damascus as Turkey, which, to a lot of people would have just seemed like that can only be possible in an alternate universe, seems much more possible now. You have said, the status of Rojava will cease to be an issue between Israel and Turkey, but will represent a dramatic shift. You've also said, which I think is connected to what you just said about if there is a role for Turkey in the context or from the perspective of the US, it will be more to the north of Turkey, so the Black Sea and some of those, Russia-influenced areas. It seems to be in line with your other analysis that, as you've also said, perhaps the US has no plan or no grand strategy for the Middle East, which, obviously brings all sorts of risks in and of itself, which is another thing to perhaps to discuss for another time. But
yes, please, when you gave reference to the grand strategy, you said perhaps perhaps don't have a grand strategy. But this is why actually I directly refer to Tom Barak interview on Financial Times. Literally, they say that they don't have, and if they say so, which is also very much overlapping with the practice of the United States of America in the region. Yes, they prioritize to back Israel. Israel's security of Israel is a primary priority for the United States of America, but this does not mean necessarily the United States of America, as it used to be in past, have a strategy, have a plan for the Middle East.
So, and it seems like that is because it has and as you've said as well, an Israel-focused Middle East policy. So, they are happy, it seems, for and this doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen or not, but they are happy for the region to be redesigned in accordance with the kind of express security needs of the Israeli state. Now, of course, that brings many risks with it. And some have also argued that not having a grand strategy is by design at this stage, particularly of the US, in terms of, I guess if you're a power with one of the biggest military capacities in the world, you can get away with not having a strategy because there is quite a lot of military capacity behind that. And I think a lot of people see the risks in that. But what I also wanted to ask is, does it seem like, Turkey's basically acceptance of the US's so-called Gaza plan is in line with its somewhat accepting its shifting role in relation to the United States, perhaps shifting more to the north? Do you think that's also in line with it accepting or seeming to accept the Gaza plan?
Quite in line. Why? Because what Erdogan accepted at the end of the day in the context of Gaza plan, actually a way of betrayal of Hamas. Because as I tried to explain, Turkey has already lost its reputation, and it has a negative reputation in the Middle East. And Muslim Brotherhood at best, or namely Hamas, was the very last stronghold Turkey was relying on to have some, maneuver or space to operate in the Middle East. And with Gaza plan, actually, by accepting to withdraw its support from Hamas, in my point of view, acknowledge Turkey's, low profile or low profile role in near future.
We spoke a lot about the role of states and the strategies and the lacks of strategies, or like the absence of strategies. What I would like to ask, perhaps as a final question, is obviously all of these strategies and approaches and plans and so on affects millions and millions of people, millions of people trying to live their life, or also, as we see in some parts of the region, trying to build alternatives to what they have seen or, and have experienced the results of, particularly a century of borders drawn by those who basically don't live there. I think we can put it in a basic sense. What do you think are some of the opportunities or some of the ways in which the people and peoples and society, and I think here particularly women, can develop or can achieve in the context of obviously these kind of macro geopolitical calculations?
I forgot a very important aspect of Turkey's, when I was trying to explain Turkey's weakness in the region. I mentioned about its economic crisis, challenge, and its, I mentioned about Turkey's political instability, but I didn't mention about Turkey's military capacity. So this is also, in terms of making predictions about Turkey's future, role in the Middle East today and in future, while power is the determining factor in both growth politics and the region, Turkey is clearly quite disadvantaged, not only because of its economic vulnerability, but also because of its political instability. More importantly, if we are talking about power, Turkey today, as Turkey also, the political leaders in Turkey confessed, Turkey militarily also quite disadvantaged in comparison with, for instance, Turkey's rivals like Israel, or Turkey's rivals like the Gulf state. About your question, I would like to, in terms of the power of people, I would like to first refer to what has happened in last 2 years' time in Gaza. Nowadays, we are just in the days of the second anniversary of the war in Gaza. Can you imagine people, like 2 million people in a very narrow strip without even access to food, forget weapons, forget other, any other material. They don't even have access to food, could resist for 2 years against the most powerful states, namely Israel first and foremost, but also the United States of America. And at the end of the day, yes, given the Gaza plan, we can claim that Hamas is defeated. But at the end of the day, can we claim that, or can we be clear and certain about the success of Israel? First and foremost, Israel lost very hardly gained legitimacy, not only in the region, but also in the world. And even today, we experience how Israel is gradually isolated from the rest of the world, while some, for instance, Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Israeli potential partner in the region, or United Arab Emirates, or Egypt, or Jordan, are seeking to build up some relations with other actors, including Iran, to balance Israel power in the region. So that's why, if the question is what sort of a potential people have, I think first what we have seen in Gaza in last 2 years' time is a good example to make an estimation or prediction about the potential role of people, simply people on the ground. Second, for sure, the Kurdish people in the region, in Rojava in particular. I was in Tishrin in January 2025, I mean, at the beginning of this year, and I have witnessed, it was not for the first time I have experienced, but this was the last time I again acknowledged that against the will of people, particularly against the will of Kurdish people, whatever Öcalan says, whatever the political or strategic considerations of the PKK are, at the end of the day, as far as those political priorities or orientations or preferences meet with the expectations of people, then those political actors could, have some power to achieve what they aim at. And this is actually, once again, reminds me what I have learned in Makhmour. And as at the beginning of this interview, I argued that what I have discovered at the end of my research, the PKK's strength derives from not its capacity of weapons or its fighters or whatever it has in terms of making war, but its strength derives from to what extent its political goals and orientation means with the expectations of people. So that's why, yes, unfortunately, what to a large extent determines the course of developments as of today in the world and region is the power, either economic, political, or military power. But it's important to what extent whatever is in place today sustainable in future. And in my point of view, again, the case in Gaza or the case in Rojava simply give us idea about the potential contribution of people to the course of developments in the region.
Thank you very much, Arzu. This was a really, really incredible and eye-opening conversation. And I'm sure we'll have more conversations with you because there's absolutely way more to discuss. So thank you very much.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks to you also.
Thank you. And that's it for today's conversation of the Amargi Mosaic. As I said at the start, we're a grassroots funded project, so your support really helps us keep going. Follow us at theamargi.com and on our socials to stay connected. And let's keep having the conversation. Until next time, take care.